In the early morning hours of June 7, 1992, in Springfield, Missouri, 3 women vanished without a trace from a quiet suburban home. There were no signs of forced entry. No neighbors reported hearing a struggle. Their purses, keys, and cars were all left behind, as if they had planned to return within minutes. The missing women were 47-year-old Cheryl Levitt, her 19-year-old daughter Suzanne Susie Streeter, and Susie's friend Stacy McCall. The night before, the 2 teenagers had celebrated their high school graduation. By the time the sun rose the next morning, all 3 were gone. More than 3 decades later, the disappearance of what became known as the Springfield 3 remains one of the most puzzling unsolved cases in American criminal history. In 1992, the city of Springfield was known as a stable and growing community in the southwestern part of the state. With a population of just over 140,000 at the time, it was large enough to have a busy commercial center, yet small enough that many residents still described it as a place where neighbors recognized one another. Often referred to as the Queen City of the Ozarks, Springfield served as a regional hub for nearby rural towns. Families were drawn to the area for its relatively low crime rate, its schools, and its quiet residential neighborhoods. One of those neighborhoods was located along East Delmar Street, a modest suburban area lined with single-story homes, driveways, and neatly kept lawns. It was here that Cheryl Levitt lived, a local cosmetologist who had built a reputation among friends and clients as a warm and outgoing person. Cheryl had raised her daughter, Suzanne Susie Streeter, largely on her own. By the spring of 1992, Susie had just graduated from high school and was preparing for the next stage of her life. Her close friend Stacy McCall had also recently graduated, and like many teenagers that weekend, the 2 had been celebrating their accomplishment. On the evening of June 6th, graduation parties were taking place across the city. It was a normal Saturday night, the kind filled with friends, laughter, and the excitement of young people stepping into adulthood. Nothing about that evening suggested that, within hours, 3 residents of Springfield would disappear in a way that would haunt the community for decades. On the evening of June 6, 1992, graduation celebrations were taking place across Springfield. Among the graduates were Suzanne Susie Streeter and her friend Stacy McCall, who had just completed their studies at Kickapoo High School. Like many students that night, the 2 spent the evening attending graduation parties with friends. According to those present, the gatherings were typical for a graduation weekend, groups of teenagers moving between homes, celebrating the end of high school and the beginning of summer. At some point during the late evening, Susie and Stacy had originally planned to stay overnight at the home of another friend. However, the house reportedly became crowded with guests, and the girls decided to change their plans. Shortly after 2 a.m. on June 7th, they left the gathering and drove to Susie's home on East Delmar Street, where Susie lived with her mother, Cheryl Levitt. Friends later confirmed that the 2 arrived safely. Their car was parked outside the house, and nothing appeared unusual at the time. The next morning, the first signs that something was wrong began to emerge. Around mid-morning on June 7th, a friend of the girls went to the house looking for them. When she arrived, she noticed that both Susie's and Stacy's cars were parked in the driveway. Inside the home, Cheryl Levitt's vehicle was also still there. The front door was unlocked. At first glance, the house appeared normal. Personal belongings were scattered in ordinary places: purses, makeup, cigarettes, and clothing. The women's purses were all found together inside the home, containing their identification and money. But none of the 3 women were there. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken windows. It appeared as if the women had simply stepped out. Yet as the hours passed, it became clear that they had not returned, and no one had seen them leave. As friends and family members tried to understand what had happened inside the house on East Delmar Street, several unusual details began to emerge. One of the first things noticed was that the women's personal belongings had been left behind. Inside the home, investigators later found the purses belonging to Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall placed together. Their keys, identification, and money were still inside. For most people, Leaving home without their purse or car keys would be highly unusual, especially for 3 individuals at the same time. Another detail involved the telephone. According to early reports, a friend who had arrived at the house that morning answered a strange voicemail message left on the answering machine. The message was described as disturbing or inappropriate in tone. However, the message was accidentally erased before law enforcement could review it, eliminating a potential piece of evidence. There was also a small but puzzling detail outside the house. A porch light globe near the front door had been shattered. Initially, it appeared that the glass had been broken during the night. But when investigators looked closer, it became difficult to determine whether the damage had occurred during the incident or afterward. Some visitors who came to the home that morning admitted they had cleaned up broken glass from the porch before police arrived, believing it was simply debris that could cause someone to cut their foot. In doing so, they may have unintentionally disturbed a possible crime scene. Inside the house, there were no clear signs of forced entry. No evidence suggested a violent struggle had taken place. Beds appeared slept in, and everyday items were left where they would normally be. Taken together, the scene created a confusing picture. 3 women had apparently vanished from inside a home, leaving nearly everything behind. Yet the house itself showed few clear clues about how or why they disappeared. Once it became clear that the 3 women had not returned home, authorities in Springfield began a formal investigation. The case quickly drew the attention of the Springfield Police Department, which treated the disappearance as a possible abduction. Detectives began by examining the home on East Delmar Street. Because several friends and relatives had already entered the house earlier that morning, investigators faced an immediate challenge. Parts of the scene had been unintentionally disturbed before police arrived. Even so, officers carefully documented the environment inside the home. They confirmed that there were no obvious signs of forced entry and no clear evidence of a struggle. Personal belongings belonging to all 3 women were still inside the residence. Investigators also confirmed that all 3 vehicles remained parked at the house. The disappearance of 3 individuals at the same time was highly unusual, and the case quickly gained media attention across Missouri and neighboring states. Search efforts expanded rapidly. Law enforcement organized ground searches, distributed flyers, and interviewed friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen suspicious activity in the area during the night of June 6th or early morning of June 7th. Tips began to arrive from across the region. Detectives interviewed dozens of people connected to the women's lives, including friends who had attended the graduation parties the night before. These interviews helped confirm the timeline of events leading up to the disappearance. Despite the growing number of leads, investigators struggled to identify a clear suspect. Over the months that followed, the investigation expanded beyond the city. The Federal Bureau of Investigation eventually became involved, assisting local authorities with the case. Searches were conducted in nearby rural areas, fields, and bodies of water throughout the Ozarks region. Authorities also reviewed reports of possible sightings of the women in other states, though none were confirmed. As time passed, the case became increasingly difficult to solve. With no confirmed witnesses, no ransom demands, and no clear forensic evidence pointing to a suspect, the disappearance of the 3 women remained a mystery. Yet investigators continued to receive tips, some credible, many not, each requiring careful review in the hope that one might lead to answers. As the days passed without answers, the disappearance of the 3 women began to deeply affect residents of Springfield. Springfield had long been considered a relatively safe city, and the idea that 3 people could vanish from a home during the night unsettled many in the community. The case quickly became the subject of constant local discussion. Newspapers ran daily updates, television stations covered search efforts, and residents closely followed every new development. Vigils were organized for Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne Susie Streeter, and Stacy McCall. Friends, classmates, and neighbors gathered to show support for the families and to keep public attention focused on the case. Flyers with the women's photographs appeared in stores, schools, and community bulletin boards across the region. For many residents, the case changed how they thought about safety. Parents who had previously allowed their teenagers to come and go freely began setting stricter rules. Some residents reported installing better locks or outdoor lighting. Others became more cautious about unfamiliar vehicles or strangers in their neighborhoods. At Kickapoo High School, where Susie and Stacy had recently graduated, classmates struggled to process the sudden disappearance of two people they had celebrated with just hours earlier. What had begun as a weekend of graduation parties quickly turned into a period of confusion and fear. The families of the missing women also became central voices in keeping the case alive. They spoke to reporters, participated in interviews, and encouraged the public to continue sharing information with investigators. As months turned into years, the case remained unresolved. Yet in Springfield, the story of the three missing women never faded completely from public memory. Instead, it became one of the most enduring mysteries in the region, a reminder that even in places considered safe, unanswered questions can linger for decades. Over the years, investigators and journalists have examined several possible explanations for what happened to the three women. While many rumors have circulated publicly, law enforcement has focused only on theories supported by documented evidence or credible leads. 45. One of the earliest possibilities considered by investigators was that the women were abducted by someone who either knew them or had been watching the house. Because there were no clear signs of forced entry, authorities suggested the women may have opened the door voluntarily or been confronted outside the home. Another theory that has received attention involves a man named Robert Craig Cox. Cox was already a convicted criminal who had previously been linked to violent offenses in other states. In the early 1990s, he had lived in the Springfield area and was later questioned by investigators. Cox has never been charged in connection with the disappearance of the three women. However, during later interviews from prison, he reportedly told journalists that he knew what had happened to them and that their bodies would never be found. Law enforcement has never confirmed that he provided verifiable information about the case. Another theory occasionally discussed involves the possibility that the women were taken to a remote location outside the city. Because the surrounding Ozarks region contains large rural areas, forests, and abandoned properties, investigators have searched numerous sites over the years. At one point, attention briefly focused on a parking garage at Cox Health Center after a tip suggested the women might have been buried beneath the structure during its construction. Ground-penetrating radar was reportedly used to examine the site, but no conclusive evidence was discovered. Despite these leads and investigations, none of the theories has been proven. Authorities have consistently emphasized that the case remains open and that many of the public claims surrounding it are not supported by verified evidence. What remains certain is that the disappearance of the three women occurred within a very narrow window of time, and whoever was responsible left behind very few clues. More than 3 decades after the events of June 7, 1992, the disappearance of the three women in Springfield remains unsolved. The case is still classified as an active missing persons investigation by the Springfield Police Department. Although it is often described publicly as a cold case, authorities have stated that investigators continue to review tips and periodically re-examine evidence. Over the years, advancements in forensic technology have led many law enforcement agencies across the United States to reopen older cases in search of new leads. While no major breakthrough has been publicly announced in this investigation, officials have indicated that evidence from the original case remains preserved. The Federal Bureau of Investigation continues to list Susie Streeter, Stacy McCall, and Cheryl Levitt in national missing persons databases. Their information is also maintained in public awareness programs designed to encourage new tips. In addition, the case has been featured in numerous documentaries, news investigations, and crime programs over the years. These reports have helped keep public attention focused on the disappearance and have occasionally generated new leads, though none have yet resulted in confirmed answers. As of today, no one has been charged in connection with the case. Investigators still encourage anyone with information, even details that may seem minor, to contact authorities. In many long unsolved investigations, new witnesses or overlooked evidence have eventually led to breakthroughs decades later. For the families of the missing women and for the community that has followed the case since 1992, the hope for answers has never completely disappeared. The disappearance of Cheryl Levitt, Suzanne "Susie" Streeter, and Stacy McCall remains one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of Springfield. What makes the case especially troubling is not only that 3 people vanished, but how little evidence was left behind. Inside a quiet home on East Delmar Street, everyday items remained exactly where they should have been: purses, cars, and personal belongings untouched. Yet the people who owned them were gone. For investigators, the case represents the challenge of solving a crime with almost no clear starting point. For the families and friends of the women, it has meant decades of unanswered questions. Over time, new generations in Springfield have grown up hearing about what locals simply call the Springfield Three. The story has become part of the city's collective memory, a reminder of a night that changed the community's sense of safety. Despite the passage of time, the case has never been closed. Law enforcement continues to encourage the public to come forward with information, no matter how small it may seem. In many long unsolved investigations, critical details have surfaced years later, sometimes from witnesses who only then felt able to speak. Until that happens, the disappearance of the 3 women remains unresolved. And the events of that June night in 1992 continue to stand as a quiet but persistent question, one that the city of Springfield is still waiting to answer.